The Big Short tells the story of the 2008 financial crisis, which was one of the biggest economic disasters in modern history. While millions of people lost their homes, jobs, and savings, a small group of people saw something everyone else missed and made billions by betting against the system. But this movie isn't just about who was right or who got rich. It's about greed. Not just the greed for money, but the greed to be right, the greed for recognition, the greed for power, and the greed to protect a broken system. Every major character in the movie represents a different kind of greed. Some are obvious, others are hidden beneath intelligence, morality, or professionalism. Let's climb the 7 levels of greed in The Big Short. At the bottom of this ladder is Ben Rickard. Unlike everyone else in the movie, Ben doesn't celebrate the opportunity in front of him. He understands that every dollar he earns from this trade will come at someone else's expense. Ben is a former trader who walked away from Wall Street years ago because he became disillusioned with the financial system. He's the only character who has already escaped the game, yet he's forced back into it when Charlie and Jamie discover the housing bubble and need his help to access the market. His greed, if we can even call it that, is almost non-existent. Ben isn't chasing wealth or recognition. He's simply taking advantage of a market that is already destined to collapse. He knows the crash is inevitable whether he participates or not. The only difference is who profits from it. The best example of this comes when Charlie and Jamie finally realize they will make millions of dollars. They are ecstatic as their years of hard work are finally going to pay off. They start to celebrate and dance, but Ben doesn't celebrate. Instead, he interrupts them with one of the most powerful lines in the movie, a blunt reminder that they just bet against the American economy. He reminds them families will lose their homes, people will lose their pensions, entire communities will collapse. In that moment, Ben becomes the moral compass of the film. He understands something the younger investors don't. Financial markets aren't just numbers on a screen. Behind every trade are real people. That's why Ben belongs at level 1 at the bottom of the ladder. He still profits from the crisis, but profit isn't what drives him. His participation is reluctant, not enthusiastic. If greed exists within him, it's the smallest and most understandable form, the desire to protect himself while navigating a system he already knows is broken. Ben represents people who understand that the game is corrupt but realize they can't stop it alone. They can only decide whether they'll stand outside the system or survive inside it. But while Ben sees money as a necessary consequence, the next character sees the crisis as something far more personal. The next step on this ladder is Mark Baum, and at first glance, he doesn't seem greedy at all. In fact, he's probably the most moral character in the entire movie. He despises Wall Street, hates corruption, and genuinely believes the financial system has become a giant fraud. But greed isn't always about money. Sometimes, it's about the overwhelming desire to see a corrupt system finally collapse. When Mark first hears about Michael Burry's trade, he doesn't believe it. But once he begins investigating, interviewing mortgage brokers, visiting Florida, and examining the mortgage-backed securities himself, he realizes something terrifying. The entire housing market is built on lies. Banks are giving loans to people who clearly can't repay them. Mortgage brokers are earning commissions regardless of whether borrowers default. Investment banks are packing these terrible loans into securities and selling them around the world. And rating agencies continue giving these securities AAA ratings, pretending everything is perfectly safe. Unlike Ben Rickard, who accepts that the system is broken, Mark can't let it go. He becomes obsessed. He isn't simply trying to make money anymore. He wants someone to admit the truth. Throughout the movie, he constantly confronts bankers, traders, and executives, demanding answers they refuse to give. Every new discovery only makes him angrier. His trade slowly stops becoming just an investment. It becomes a crusade. Mark wants Wall Street to be exposed. He wants the people responsible to be punished. He wants the entire system to face the consequences of its own corruption. That's his form of greed. It's the greed for justice. Ironically, this moral obsession also makes him incredibly wealthy. The worse the financial system performs, the more money he makes. Every foreclosure, every failed bank, every family losing their home pushes his trade further into profit. That contradiction is what makes Mark such a fascinating character. He's one of the few people who wants the truth to come out, but the only way he can prove he was right is if millions of innocent people suffer first. By the end of the film, even after making an enormous fortune, Mark doesn't feel victorious. He feels empty. He realizes that exposing corruption doesn't necessarily change it. Mark teaches us that greed doesn't always wear the face of selfishness. Sometimes it hides behind noble intentions. The desire for justice can become so consuming that, without realizing it, you begin rooting for the very disaster you're trying to expose. But while Mark is driven by emotion and outrage, the next level is far colder. He wants to prove that everyone else is wrong. The third level belongs to Michael Burry, the man who saw the collapse long before anyone else did. At first, it might seem strange to call him greedy. After all, he was one of the few people telling the truth while everyone else was lying. But greed isn't always measured by how much money someone wants. Sometimes it's measured by how badly they need to be right. Unlike Mark Baum, who is driven by outrage, Michael Burry is driven by conviction. He's a doctor-turned-investor who spends months reading through thousands of mortgage documents. While everyone else sees a booming housing market, Burry notices something almost no one bothers to look at: the quality of the loans themselves. He discovers that millions of adjustable-rate mortgages are about to reset. Borrowers won't be able to afford the higher payments, and the entire housing market is standing on a foundation of bad debt. Most people would have dismissed the idea, but Burry doubled down. He doesn't just predict the crash, he invests over $1 billion of his clients' money against the housing market, knowing that if he's wrong, his career will likely be over. As the months pass, the housing market refuses to collapse. Instead of making money, Burry's funds begin losing millions on paper because banks continue manipulating the prices of the credit default swaps he bought. Investors panic. They demand their money back. Some even threaten legal action. But Burry refuses to back down. He blocks withdrawals from his fund, ignores criticism, and continues holding his position because he's convinced his research is correct. This is where his greed reveals itself. It is not the greed for wealth, but the greed to be proven right. Ironically, this conviction itself may have cost him billions. As pressure from angry investors continued to mount, Burry was eventually forced to unwind much of his position earlier than he wanted. Initially, Burry put a bet of $8 billion against the housing market. But as investors revolted and put pressure on him, Burry had to reduce his bet to $2.3 billion. Had he been able to hold the trade until its full potential, Scion Capital could have made roughly $2.5 billion in profit, and Burry himself could have earned around $350 million. Yet throughout the movie, he never talks about missing those profits. His obsession was never maximizing every last dollar. It was proving that his analysis was right all along. When the housing market finally collapsed, Burry made $100 million for himself and over $700 million for his investors. But by then, the money almost feels secondary. What truly matters is that the world finally catches up to the conclusion he reached years earlier. Unlike Mark Baum, who seeks justice, Burry seeks validation. He isn't fighting the system because he hates it. He's fighting it because he's certain his analysis is better than everyone else's. That not only makes him brilliant, but also makes him dangerous. Because once someone becomes completely convinced they're right, every obstacle begins to look like ignorance rather than disagreement. But while Michael Burry's greed is rooted in conviction, the next characters don't care about proving a theory or exposing corruption. They've just realized there's an opportunity to become rich, and they can't wait to seize it. The fourth level belongs to Charlie Geller and Jamie Shipley, two young investors who accidentally stumbled upon the greatest investment opportunity of their lives. Charlie and Jamie aren't trying to expose corruption or prove a theory. They're simply looking for the opportunity of a lifetime. That's what they do for a living. As young investors running a tiny fund, they were constantly searching for inconsistencies in the market, places where prices don't reflect reality. Every successful investor does this. Find what's mispriced, place your bet, and wait for the market to correct itself. They're always hunting for the next big opportunity. And that's exactly what they found. When they discover Michael Burry's trade, they quickly realize that the entire housing market is built on a lie. But unlike Burry, who spent months buried in mortgage documents, Charlie and Jamie don't uncover the fraud themselves. They recognize someone else's insight and immediately understand what it could mean. For Charlie and Jamie, discovering the truth is valuable because it creates an opportunity. If the market is wrong, there's money to be made. They spend almost the entire movie trying to gain access to the trade. They travel across the country, convince Ben Rickard to help them, meet bankers who dismiss them because of their fund size, and overcome every obstacle standing between them and the biggest financial bet of their lives. Their determination is admirable, but it's also driven by greed. Not the destructive greed of Wall Street, but the very human greed to seize an opportunity before anyone else does. Jamie especially embodies this excitement. He's energetic, impatient, and fascinated by the idea that two outsiders could outsmart the biggest banks in the world. Every step forward brings them closer not only to proving the system is broken, but also to becoming millionaires. The clearest example comes when the housing market finally begins collapsing. Charlie and Jamie realize their trade has worked. Overnight, they've made an extraordinary amount of money. They celebrate. For a brief moment, all they can see are the numbers. It's Ben Rickard who immediately stops them. He reminds them that their celebration represents millions of people losing their homes, their jobs, and their savings. The fortune they've just made exists because someone else's life has fallen apart. They're not evil, they're not creating the crisis, but unlike the previous levels, they're genuinely excited by what the collapse means for their own future. Their first instinct isn't to think about the victims, it's to celebrate the victory. Charlie and Jamie represent the kind of greed most people can relate to. The desire to recognize an opportunity, take a risk, and change your life forever. Left unchecked, that excitement can make you forget the human cost behind the numbers. But while Charlie and Jamie simply take advantage of a broken system, the next character does something far more dangerous. He turns that broken system into a business model. The fifth level belongs to Jared Vennett. He never pretends to be anything he's not. Jared doesn't see the financial crisis as a tragedy, he sees it as an opportunity. He's the Wall Street salesman who accidentally receives Michael Burry's proposal to short the housing market. The moment he understands what Burry has discovered, he doesn't think about the consequences for homeowners or the economy. His first thought is much simpler. How do I make money from this? Unlike Charlie and Jamie, he isn't an ambitious outsider trying to break into Wall Street. Jared is already inside the system. He knows exactly how it works, and more importantly, he knows how to profit from it. The moment he realizes Burry is right, he begins selling the same trade to anyone willing to buy it. Every new client means another commission. Every new credit default swap means another paycheck. The worse the housing market becomes, the richer Jared gets. What's fascinating about Jared is that he never tries to justify his actions. Throughout the movie, he's charming, sarcastic, and brutally honest. He knows Wall Street is built on conflicts of interest. He knows the banks have created a financial time bomb. He simply chooses to profit from it. He isn't guilty, angry, or thinking about the human cost. To Jared, if a broken system presents an opportunity to make millions, he'll take it without hesitation. And from his perspective, someone else would do exactly the same if he didn't. In many ways, Jared represents the modern Wall Street mindset. Information isn't something to fix, it's something to monetize. He understands the system is corrupt, but instead of questioning it, he packages that corruption into a product and sells it. He doesn't create the crisis or hide the crisis. He simply turns the crisis into a business. But even Jared is still just taking advantage of a system built by others. The next level is far more dangerous. These are the people who knowingly created the fraud in the first place because every bad loan meant another paycheck. The sixth level does not belong to one person, but to an entire industry: the mortgage brokers and lenders. Until now, we've looked at people who simply recognized an opportunity inside a broken financial system. But these are the people who actually helped create the problem in the first place. The housing bubble began with one thing: a loan. And during the early 2000s, mortgage brokers were handing them out to almost anyone who walked through the door. Their income didn't matter, employment didn't matter, Sometimes even the borrower's ability to repay didn't matter. As long as the paperwork could be signed, the loan would be approved. The movie perfectly captures this during Mark Baum's trip to Florida. He meets a mortgage broker who casually explains that people with no income, no job, and no assets were still receiving mortgages. These became known as ninja loans. The broker isn't embarrassed, he's proud of it. Why? Because every mortgage he approved meant another commission. Whether that borrower defaulted 6 months later wasn't his problem anymore. The loan had already been sold. This is where greed becomes truly dangerous. The broker isn't thinking about families losing their homes. The lender isn't thinking about the stability of the banking system. Everyone is thinking about the next commission check. The risk no longer belongs to them, it belongs to someone else. And that's exactly why the fraud spread so quickly. The people making the loans have absolutely no incentive to make good loans. In fact, the worse the lending standards become, the more mortgages they can write, and the more money they make. For the first time in our ladder, greed isn't just motivating an individual, it's built directly into the business model. The system actually rewards irresponsible behavior. More loans, more commissions, more profits, and no accountability. This is what economists call a moral hazard. When people no longer bear the consequences of their own actions, they naturally begin taking bigger and bigger risks. The mortgage industry didn't simply participate in the housing bubble, it manufactured it. Millions of bad loans were created because every person involved got paid immediately, while someone else would deal with the consequences years later. But even this industry couldn't have caused a global financial crisis on its own. For these toxic mortgages to spread across the world, they needed one final stamp of approval. And that's where the seventh and final level enters the picture. At the top of this ladder sit the rating agencies, the most powerful and perhaps the most overlooked form of greed in The Big Short. Unlike the mortgage brokers, they weren't writing bad loans or selling credit default swaps or placing billion-dollar bets. They were simply giving opinions, but those opinions controlled the entire financial system. When investment banks bundled thousands of risky mortgages together into mortgage-backed securities and CDOs, someone had to decide whether those investments were safe. That responsibility belonged to rating agencies like Standard & Poor's and Moody's. Their job was simple: protect investors by telling the truth. Warn the market when an investment has become too risky. Instead, they did the exact opposite. One of the most revealing moments in the movie comes when Mark Baum's team visits a representative from Standard & Poor's. He asked her the obvious question: how can these mortgage bonds still have AAA ratings when they're filled with loans that are clearly going to fail? Her answer is shocking. She explains that if Standard & Poor's refused to give banks the ratings they wanted, the banks would simply take their business to Moody's instead. In that one sentence, the entire financial crisis is exposed. The agencies responsible for protecting investors weren't being paid by investors. They were being paid by the very banks whose products they were rating. If they gave an honest rating, they lost the client. If they gave a generous rating, they earned another fee. Truth became bad for business, and greed became company policy. This wasn't the greed of one ambitious banker. It wasn't the greed of one reckless mortgage broker. It was institutional greed. A system where the people responsible for enforcing honesty were financially rewarded for looking the other way. Without those AAA ratings, pension funds, insurance companies, and investment firms around the world would have never bought these toxic securities. Without those ratings, the banks couldn't have sold them. Without buyers, the mortgage brokers couldn't have kept issuing bad loans. And without that endless demand, the housing bubble would never have grown large enough to threaten the global economy. Every previous level on this ladder depended on this one. The mortgage brokers created bad loans, investment banks packaged them, traders sold them, investors bought them. But the rating agencies gave the entire scheme legitimacy. They convinced the world that toxic assets were safe. That's why they belong at the top level of greed. Not because they made the most money, but because their greed made everyone else's greed possible. When honesty became less profitable than dishonesty, the financial crisis was no longer an accident. It became inevitable. And that's the real message of The Big Short. The greatest threat wasn't one greedy person, it was an entire system where every incentive rewarded the wrong behavior, But if you want to see what greed looks like inside a Wall Street firm on the very night that system finally begins to collapse, then subscribe and watch this video on the 7 levels of greed in margin call. It's the perfect companion to this movie.